A blockbuster ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals means that 2 Arizona voter suppression laws will remain blocked into the future. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Mark Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
You know, Paige, with all of the news going on in Washington, D.C. right now around democracy, all of the challenges to Donald Trump's illegal executive orders and DOJ and the like, sometimes it is easy to forget that democracy is on the docket literally in courtrooms around America. And boy, Paige, did we get a big one out of Arizona.
Right. Like you said, the Ninth Circuit upheld that 2 Arizona voter suppression laws violate federal law. Now, these laws are all about Republicans' big lie that non-citizens are voting en masse in elections across the country. The 2 laws at issue, HB 2243, requires county recorders to cancel a voter's registration if they receive information that a voter isn't eligible or they have reason to believe that a voter is not a U.S. citizen. And the other law, HB 2492, requires voters to submit documentary proof of citizenship to vote in federal elections. Now, Mark, to understand these laws, you need to understand what a crazy voter registration system the state of Arizona has. It has a bifurcated system. Voters are required to have documented proof of citizenship to vote in state and local elections. But depending on what voter registration form they use, they do not have to submit documented proof of citizenship in order to cast a ballot in federal elections, which would include races like Congress, Senate, and president.
Yeah. And look, Paige, this issue, this bogus issue of non-citizenship voting has really turned into the Republicans' next battle cry to try to suppress voting rights. And what people sometimes don't realize is that these terrible ideas always have an origin story. You know, sometimes the origin story is Project 2025. Sometimes the origin story is something, you know, that Donald Trump read about windmills or sharks or boats. But in this case, the origin story around these terrible laws, including the SAVE Act, a federal bill that would essentially require all this stuff. The origin story is really, you know, the crazy Republicans of Arizona. And people forget just how crazy the Arizona Republicans are. And all of the, you know, terrible voting laws and conspiracy-based theories that they were advancing. But this really, Paige, has been ground zero. And it's them exporting this that we are now seeing every place else.
Right. I think we now in 2025 think of Arizona as a swing state, right? The governor is a Democrat. The AG is a Democrat, Secretary of State. They have 2 Democratic senators right now, but it voted for Trump in the presidential election. But for a really long time, it was a Republican dominated state. And while Republicans had a trifecta, they instituted this law requiring documented proof of citizenship, meaning that you have to provide evidence that you are a U.S. citizen when you register to vote. That's something like a passport or a birth certificate. This law went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 2012, SCOTUS, in the case Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona, ruled that if voters used the federally issued voter registration form that's issued under the National Voter Registration Act, which doesn't ask for documentary proof of citizenship, Arizona must allow those voters to cast a ballot in federal elections, and that the state was violating voters' rights by doing otherwise.
I created Democracy Docket 5 years ago to help bring you the latest on the battle for democracy. Look, if you believe in free and fair elections, now is the time that Democracy Docket could use your help. Please click on the link above or in the description below to become a premium member today and help power the next 5 years. You know, to tell you how terrible the Republicans in Arizona were even back then, right? I mean, this is like, you know, this is pre-Trump, right? But they were like, to tell you how terrible they were about voting even back then, a normal reaction to the Supreme Court's ruling would be to say, okay, we are not going to require proof of citizenship. The reaction of the Republicans in Arizona was, okay, we will have one set of rules for federal elections and a different set of rules for state elections, which is, you know, you kind of glossed over this. So I want you to like help people understand this who do not live in Arizona, because if you don't live in Arizona, the notion that you would register to vote on one form for state elections and yet register to vote for on a different form for federal elections is kind of like nuts. I mean, every so often it's like, there'll be like some crazy Republican will say, well, if Congress won't do X, Y, Z, or if the courts do A, B, and C, we're just going to have our own different rules for state elections. And everyone's like, no, you're never going to do that because it would be a total burden to your election officials. And it would be, like crazy complicated for your citizenry. You'd never do that. Oh, they haven't met the Republicans in Arizona.
Right. It is such a complicated system that almost every election cycle, there's an issue with these so-called federal only voters. Now, there's about 32,000 voters in Arizona marked as federal only. Now, all of these people are eligible to vote. They have attested that they are U.S. citizens. They have attested that they are eligible to vote under the penalty of perjury, under other consequences. And there are no issues when they go to cast their ballot. They're only just allowed to vote for federal offices. Now, Mark, we saw this past fall in Arizona, there was a huge issue with DMV records, maybe mistakenly saying that some people hadn't submitted proof of citizenship, or maybe they had, but they didn't. Weeks before the election, it was a question of whether almost 100,000 people in Arizona would be able to vote. Now, I will point out a disproportionate amount of those people were Republicans. So we actually did see the Arizona Republican Party go to court and get involved in lawsuits to say that these people should be allowed to vote. So again, Republicans, I don't think actually believe that there are like tons of non-citizens voting. It's just a great talking point for them. But when it puts their own voters at risk, they're willing to drop the veil and do what's right.
Yeah, it's really, you make such an important point. When this happened in Arizona and all of a sudden, there were these 100,000 voters who had, there was a question whether they had checked the box or whether they had provided the requisite paperwork or whatever it was. There was a question because they had not maybe submitted the proof of citizenship. Well, when it turns out that they were overwhelmingly Republican, all of a sudden the Republican Party of Arizona started singing a different tune, right? Like, that they were like clear in their throat and being like, ready to disenfranchise all of them. But the moment they found out that they cut the other way, all of a sudden this political party that is demagoguing on this issue, is lying about this problem all over America. All of a sudden, they were like, well, we shouldn't penalize these voters because there's really nothing wrong with them. Like, no shit, there's nothing wrong with them. There has never been anything wrong with these voters anywhere, but yet they're able to demagogue on it. And that is, and that's where, like you said, the veil dropped on this. But, it hasn't stopped them from continuing to press this all throughout the country. So it is great. By the way, we shouldn't lose sight. Ninth Circuit, big win, block this. Like, this is, these laws have been stopped, and that's great. The Republican Party has already said they're going to appeal this to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so we will obviously at Democracy Docket keep you informed on what is happening there. But, Paige, not to go off a little bit on a tangent, but, one of the things that has happened in the last few weeks as this discussion is taking place nationally around this is, you mentioned a passport and a birth certificate. Well, one of the groups that are big losers in that are married women, right? Because married women have a higher probability of changing their last names when they become married. And obviously that doesn't change their names on their birth certificates. The birth certificate name stays the same. And so those two names no longer match. And so if you don't have a passport, if all you have is that birth certificate and you're a married woman who changed their last name, that puts you at a serious disadvantage to being able to meet this proof of citizenship law. And, it's hard to understand how the party that claims they are for traditional family values, right? Marriage, women presumably changing their last name, all of that. It feels like they're a little bit of a loss to articulate their way out of this bit of hypocrisy.
Right. And at the same time, Republicans are pushing the SAVE Act nationally, which would institute nationwide standards about documentary proof of citizenship in order to vote in federal elections. You can click the link above to watch our full video breaking down the SAVE Act. Like you said, it targets married women, divorced women. It also targets trans voters who may have changed their name or official gender identification throughout their lives. And we're also seeing reports of trans people getting passports, trying to renew their passports or getting new passports back from the federal government that has changed their gender marker, and now it may no longer match what they have on other government forms. So it really is a way to suppress specific groups of voters who, oh, by the way, may tend to vote Democrat over Republican, and as well just inject more chaos into our election system so that Republicans can further claim that there are issues that they need to fix. And by fix, they really mean just find new ways to suppress voters.
Yeah, and so look, I mean, this is just a pretext on their part to disenfranchise voters. I wrote something on Democracy Docket. I hope everybody is already subscribed, but I wrote something on Democracy Docket about how this issue connects up also to birthright citizenship, because after all, the theory by which passports and birth certificates are proof of citizenship is that everyone who has a U.S. birth certificate is a U.S. citizen. Everyone who has a U.S. passport is a U.S. citizen. Well, if you do away with birthright citizenship, then of course not everyone who has a U.S. birth certificate, who has a state issued birth certificate, would be a U.S. citizen. Now, to be clear, Donald Trump doesn't have the authority to do away with it. He's already lost that in court. I believe he's going to continue to lose that as the case goes up on appeal. But it is interesting because you can't help but believe that behind this is not just the eventual disenfranchisement of some women, and as you say, other people like trans who can't meet this requirement, but potentially something even much more dramatic, which is the removal of birth certificates as a proof of citizenship. And then you start to really get into something that looks very, very much like an authoritarian regime, where the government could decide that it will decide who qualifies and who it thinks has met that burden or not. And so that's something we are very much keeping on top of. But before we go, with the limited time we have here, Paige, there's one other notable fact of this case, which is that among the plaintiffs who won here were a group of nonprofits, organization Mi Familia Vota and Voto Latino, which, as proud my law firm represented. The Democratic National Committee was also a plaintiff, but as well, the Department of Justice, right? So the Biden Department of Justice was in this case as a plaintiff. And I don't know, Paige, is this the first voting rights Court of Appeals victory of the Trump Department of Justice, or do you think they don't see it that way?
They may not see that way, especially when you have Harmeet Dillon nominated to run the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ, which would be the part of the DOJ litigating this case. Also interesting, we saw a couple weeks ago, Republican leaders in Arizona asked the DOJ to change their stance in this case. I mean, I think we'll just have to see what the DOJ does when this case gets appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court.
So you don't think I should send them like balloons or a cake congratulating them on a big victory?
Maybe like a small floral arrangement. Nothing too grand.
All right. Well, look, everyone, I hope you take a moment to celebrate this victory, with everything else going on around democracy. I know a lot of people are, understandably very concerned and very upset, but you gotta savor your victories as well. And this was a big one. Please, as I mentioned, if you are not already supporting Democracy Docket, we need independent media now more than ever. We need unapologetically pro-democracy independent media now more than ever. And, the easiest thing you can do right now to both support Democracy Docket and also make sure you stay informed about everything that is happening to democracy in court is to sign up. It is free at the link above and in the show notes below. Thanks for joining us for this episode. We'll see you next time.